So my name's Niamh and I'm here with the LEAF project. And LEAF is Learning About Forests Ireland. And we're working together with the Green Schools. So we've Claire and Maeve here today from the Green Schools as well. So what I'm here to talk to you today about is trees. So I'm going to start sharing the screen. So just bear with me with the technology side of things. And I'm going to now, so hopefully you can all see this screen. And just for the next while, I'm going to talk about trees, and I'm going to get you to be maybe answer if we can. We're going to do a little bit of leaf identification or tree identification, and I'll be getting you to put your little answers in the chat box if you can identify any of the trees as we're going along. So I'm going to. So yeah, we're saying Fáilte go Díon Quill, welcome to the woods. And so I don't know now, because you're from schools all around Ireland, some of you will have some hedgerows, or you might have some trees in your school grounds, or you might have a local park or a local woodlands. So today really we're just going to look at to see if you can recognize any trees, and then after this or between now and the end of the week you might get outside and start looking to see if you can find any of these trees in your own school grounds. So I'm going to see if you can name some of the trees that you'll find in our hedges and woodlands. And if anyone can guess, and you can type into the chat what this tree is. Now, it's only a little baby version. It normally grows really tall. And this tree loves to grow in wet places and have the roots in wet. So if anyone knows, now someone's guessing maybe an oak. It's not an oak or a beech, but I'm going to see if I can move. So it's an alder. So if anyone knows the alder tree, it gets really, really tall, and it's really, yeah, Mr. Higgins got it there. And Oscoilge, it's the farn oak, and it loves living in wet ground. So it's one of the really good ones, like where I live near Tralee in the woods, in Ballyseedy Woods, it's got loads of alder trees that love when the river floods and its roots sit in the wet. So it's one of those, and it's really good for growing quick. If you live on a windy hill or you need a bit of shade, shelter quick, it's a really good one to have. Sorry, I jumped ahead there. So this is another tree, if you can see the leaves there, and it's really good for making hurleys. Aha, so Cushinstown got it there. That's the ash, you're right. So if anyone knows hurling, it's the clash of the ash, and it's a Fuinseog, Oscoilge as well. So very good, you all know your ash trees, that's great. So I'm going to move on now. So this, she's called the Lady of the Forest because she lets light in to the forest, and she gets quite tall. And again, she loves to grow in wet places. And if you know the Ogham alphabet, it's the first letter of the Ogham. So it's not a beech, I'm afraid, but it begins with the same letter. Yes, it's a birch tree. Yeah, this is the birch. And Oscoilge, it's be. And B is the first letter of the Ogham alphabet. So that's how the birch got that. It's the first letter. So very good. Now this is a gorgeous one, and it's just coming into flower at the moment. And you can see the flowers are on one picture and the leaves are on the other. And so people used to call it the poor man's cold and flu remedy. And you can make a drink, a summer cold remedy from the flowers. Now it's not a cherry blossom, I'm afraid. It would be, if anyone knows the quote, respect your elders. Yes, Miss Dunn, you got it there. It's the elder tree, and the elder tree is a gorgeous tree, and it makes an Oscoilge, it's a thrum, and thrum means heavy almost. And if there's any schools that live in Trim, you're called after, that's thrum, that's after the elder tree. So that's it, and the elderflowers, you all got it there, very good. And that's a really lovely one. And in the winter you get August, September, you get the little blackberries, and the birds love eating them, but they're really good for us for the winter colds and flus as well. So now here's another lovely tree, and this makes a brilliant hedge as well. And then, yeah, it's got lots of nicknames like quickthorn, whitethorn, the May bush, yeah, Aidan, yeah, you got it, the hawthorn. This is the hawthorn. And Oscuelga, it's an scach gal, which means the bright bush. And if anyone sees it at the moment, it's in full bloom and it's absolutely gorgeous. And the insects love this. And then it makes these lovely red berries in the autumn. And yesterday, Niamh would have been talking about birds, and lots of the birds come and feed on this, particularly blackbirds and thrushes. They love coming to feed on this, on the berries, the haws in the autumn time. So if anyone can recognize this guy, the leaves are on one side and there's the nuts on the other. And so it's the tree of knowledge, if you know the little story about the salmon in the pool. And also, if you like to eat Nutella, these are the nuts that are in the Nutella. So it's not chestnuts. You got it, Miss Maloney, you got it, hazel. Yeah. So it's, if you eat the nuts, you gain wisdom, but that's because the nuts are full of protein and they're good for our brains as well. So that's the hazel, which Oscuelga, we all got that, is coil. So, and that's a fabulous tree as well. It's a really good tree to have in your school grounds if you can plant it. So I'd say a lot of you might guess this tree. So this is an evergreen tree. A lot of the other trees that we have drop their leaves in the winter, whereas this tree, yeah, you've got it, you've all got it there, it's the holly. And again, it's a great, it can be a bit slow at the beginning when it's growing, but it grows into a gorgeous hedge or a really lovely tree by itself as well. And Oscuelga, it's called Quillin. So that's a lovely tree again to have in your school grounds if you have space to plant it. Okay, now this might be a bit tricky because I didn't get the full tree, I just got the leaves, but I might give you a clue there that it likes to grow in wet grounds as well, but also it's very bendy and you can make things out of it like baskets. Yeah, Miss Dunn, you got it there. It's a willow, very good. And then I was wondering if any of you could guess maybe who might be nibbling the leaves on the willow. There's nice little holes there, so. And this is the willow. And Oscuelga willow is called Salioch. And if you ever heard the song, which I'm not going to sing, it's called Down by the Sally Gardens. And so Sallies are called after willow trees because that's the Irish name for them. So Miss Breety, you might be right. It could be a caterpillar. Like we were guessing ourselves, we're not too sure. Sometimes you get, there's a leaf cutter bee, and then there's these sawflies and there's caterpillars. So there's a few creatures that could have been nibbling at the willow. So we'd have to kind of wait around to observe. But maybe if you're going out to look at your trees after this, you might see if there's any little holes in your leaves as well. And that means there's insects in the garden. And it's actually really good to have insects in the garden. As we heard yesterday from Niamh, we need insects for the birds to feed on. And tomorrow Claire's going to be talking about insects a bit as well. So so it might be nice to see if you can guess who might be nibbling. And sometimes you don't see them nibbling because they're doing it at times when we're not there. So you have to be kind of like a bit of a detective to get out there at the right time. So it could be a caterpillar, but we might never know. So now let's see if you can guess this one. It's the king of the forest. And they're the tiny little seeds or nuts that they would have grown from. Yeah, so you all know the oak tree, which is great. And again, you can always plant an oak in your school grounds and keep it, you know, it could be in a hedge or you could let it become a tree, a big tree as well. So that's great. And Oscuelga, it's called Undar. And if you've anyone called Dara or or if you live in Kildare, that's Kildara, that's called after the oak tree, or Adair as well in Limerick, that's called after the oak tree as well. So often we have the place names where we live, they're called after trees as well. So maybe you could check if there's any places close to you or where you live that are called after a tree. And it's often the Irish, Oscuelga, that the names are as well. So I suppose I wanted to go into, because we often plant trees and we forget that trees actually love to live in communities or families just like us. And so here we have everything from mushrooms that you often find growing on the dead wood or on the ground of the woodlands. And then we've things like hoverflies and moths, and we've starlings, which Niamh was talking about starlings yesterday. and we've a tiny little frog hiding in the leaves there. So it's just to remember, I suppose, in terms of biodiversity, you need to have lots of layers in the woodland, and or even when you have a few trees together, it's better than having one tree on their own, because they like to have other plants and animals all around them. Now, so what we might do now is look at some of the plants that you might find on the woodland floor. So if you go into the woods at the moment, now a lot of you might know, and also hedges, because hedges are like woodlands, but they go in straight lines. So sometimes people call them wildlife corridors or ecological corridors. And some people call them like a linear woodland, which means like a line of a woodland, as opposed to like a bigger woodland. But they're really important to connect woodlands together, because then the plants and creatures can move around. They don't just stay in the one place, they move around, and that's much healthier for the biodiversity. So here, I'd say some of you might know this guy, the herb Robert, and it's quite common. And as Gaeilge, Ruhal Rí, no Ruhal Coil, which means it likes to live at the edge of the woodland or the hedge, and it's got a lovely pink flower on it. And that flowers all year round nearly, you'll find herb Robert. Now, if anyone's in the woods at the moment, you might see wild garlic, depending on the woods that you're in, and you're able to, and that's it here, that's crave. And that's, if you pick that, you can make pesto, and it's delicious on some bread. So you can often eat the plants as well, once you know what you're picking. And here there's a few plants that sometimes people, they underestimate, because sometimes we're cleaning up the place and we pull out ivy and brambles, but actually ivy and brambles are two of the most important plants that we can have to feed birds and insects. Because between ivy and brambles, you'd have food like pollen, nectar and berries for maybe 9 months of the year. So if you're an insect or a bird or a little creature, they're actually two really important plants to have in the school grounds to feed them. And as Gaeilge, ivy is einon and bramble is dris. And then another plant that people often forget about is the amazing moss. And as Gaeilge, moss is cuinach. And moss is actually really, really important, because one of the things it does is it soaks up water and stores water. And also birds use moss to help make their nests, like little wrens. And then other creatures like woodlice and slugs and snails all use it to eat as well. So often we walk past moss and we don't take any notice of it, but it's actually a really important plant in the woodland. Now, here's a few other plants that you're likely to find. You can see the bugle, and that's Glosser Quilla, which again means that it grows in the woods or at the edge of the woods. We have wild strawberries, and which are Sooth Halloon, and they'll be coming into fruit soon, so they're gorgeous to eat. And ferns as well, Rahanach. And ferns are really important part of the woodlands as well. You'll find them growing. So you might find ferns growing even in corners in the school grounds, and that's a really important to leave them there as well, because they like damp, shady places. So it's the same here with sorrel. If anyone knows sorrel, it has a bit of a vinegary taste, and it's sour bow, which means the cows probably like to eat it. And that's a lovely one that you'll often get growing under trees and hedges. And then we've red campion, which is a gorgeous plant, and the bumblebees love it and the butterflies love it. And that's called Cuireán Coilech, which again means that it grows at the edge of the woodlands. Now, with Leaf on the website, we actually have, and I think Maeve, you put the links to this, the spotter sheets, so that you could print them and go out and have a look for things that are, so there's a few trees and a few plants, and there's one for May and there's one for June. I think we have up to February to June, so you can print them off anytime, and you could get out and have a look in your own school grounds, see what you can find. So I suppose the next thing is to think, because often schools are creating maybe like insect hotels or little habitats, but often what we do is we'd put logs around trees when we're planting them, because they say that in dead wood, there's actually more life in dead wood than in living wood, because there's lots of larvae of creatures that can live in wood for a long time, and they're breaking it down. So we'd often surround, so when we're planting trees, we'll put logs around them. And then if you can gather any leaves or twigs or logs and put them in the corners in your school grounds or under the trees and hedges, this is where, if you see that tiny little frog, that's just a little froglet from like just out of the pond. That's from last year. That's where they're going to hide in the, because if you're out mowing the grass or playing on the football pitch, none of the creatures will live there, but they live in the corners where there's kind of piles of leaves and logs and things for them to stay safe. So it's a good job if you go out and pick up any leaves and logs and you're tidying up the school grounds at the same time, you can put them in a corner, and that's like a little habitat, little woodland habitat for all these creatures. So there'll be hedgehogs and little maybe bank voles and little frogs. They're the guys that will live in those places. So I suppose this is the next thing we do. We have a project called Untitled Chapter, which means the little woodland. And we go into schools to plant. So we think planting trees is one of the most important things you can do. And you can always make room for a few trees in your school grounds. So, and this is actually Rachel. Rachel works with Leaf as well. And she does a lot of this work with me. Now, so I suppose what we do is we collect the acorns and hazelnuts in the autumn, and then we grow them and in small boxes or pots. And a lot of the schools that we work with do this as well. And that's just to show you the roots. When the acorn falls onto the ground, its root goes down into the ground first, and it does that over the winter. And then in the spring, it pops up its shoot and then gets its leaves. And then we pot them on, and it might be 2 years before we're planting them out. And here is a project. We planted 6 quilviogs in Limerick. We have a leaf project in Limerick, and this is Scullwater Day. And they just had a space in their school grounds that it was just grass and there was nothing happening in it. So we would have planted a couple of 100 trees. And if you can see, when we were planting the trees, we also put down cardboard and bark mulch, because cardboard comes from wood and bark mulch comes from wood. So we were trying to get the trees to think they were in a woodland. And also the cardboard and bark mulch helps to kill off the grass, because the grass will compete with the trees for the first few years. So if you can see the top photo and the bottom photo, that's the same place within a few years of growing. I think even only 2 years, this place grew really quickly. So that's it. That was a primary school, and they were out planting. They did it over 2 days, and then we put up some signs. And that's just to show you the picture on the far, like 2018, that was the green blank space. And then the picture over in the corner was a year later. We were just having a summer day there. So it just shows you how you can plant a little woodland in a corner of your school. And we leave a space like a little U shape in the middle where you could put logs, and that's where you'd go and sit. And you could do classroom or well-being or quiet time or have your lunch. And but it's just a lovely place to be out in nature, in the school grounds. And this is just to show you, I suppose, behind the scenes where we store the trees in like a nursery, like a little tree nursery, and we take them out the following winter because they have bare roots. You can only plant them between October and March. And other than that, you can only plant in the summertime. At this time of the year, you'd have to plant them out of pots. So there's certain times that you can and can not plant bare root trees. Yeah, so Garam Mahogany. And I suppose we have time for if there's any questions, or if anyone needs any, a bit more information, or if you have a tree. I suppose the other thing is, if you're going outside and having a look, if you can't identify the tree, you can always send in a little picture as well, just to see if we can figure it out. But it's a good idea sometimes when you're trying to identify a tree to look at the leaf, but also look at the twigs and look at the bark. because sometimes if you pick just one leaf, it can look like another tree as well. So, aha, someone has a cache there. What is the strongest tree in Ireland? That's a very good question. I'm going to, like, well, it's not, it's a bit of a guess. There's softwood trees and there's hardwood trees. So some of the softwood trees might be like the Sitka spruce, or an elder tree could be softwood as well. Hardwood, I was doing some sawing recently and I found that apple wood was really hard to saw and oak wood was hard. Whereas when I sawed some rowan tree, it wasn't so hard. So I'd say some woods are harder than others, and I'm guessing that the ash and the oak and apple, crabapple, they're probably harder, but I might have to research that a bit. Now, there was a question. Ooh. Someone asked a minute ago, it's just about silver birch. Are they in Ireland, we have silver birch and downy birch. So they can look a bit similar and a bit different. And sometimes they've crossed over as well. So it's not always easy to tell. What's the oldest tree in Ireland? Now, myself and Claire had this discussion because there's a few different trees that people claim are the oldest ones. And if you remember the picture at the very beginning of the slideshow there, that's the Brine Brew oak. And that's in Toongraney in Clare. And that's meant to be around 1,000 years old. But then we were saying there's another yew tree up in Fermanagh. And I think Claire mentioned there's a yew tree in Maynooth, is it?
Yeah, I say the Maynooth one is the oldest because that's where I went to college, but that might not be very scientifically accurate.
That's okay. And you know yourself that there's often stories around trees and people want to have the oldest tree and the tallest tree so I'm guessing that there's a few trees that are really old, not just the one, because there's one in the Killarney Muckross, the Abbey in Muckross, and that's meant to be around 800 years old as well. Now, some of the chat is you're asking so many questions. I'm going to go back up for a second. Well, I'll go here. Can you eat sorrel, or do you need to cook it before you eat it? You can eat a bit of it raw, but you wouldn't eat loads of it raw because it actually has an acid in it called oxalic acid. And if you eat too much of it, it just can make it can make your stomach a bit sore. But so you could cook it with nettles and make nettle and sorrel soup, and that would be very good for you with a bit of cream. Would taste lovely. So what's the best tree for carbon sequestration? That's a big word, sequestration. That means storing carbon. So that is a very good question. Some people would say that the evergreen trees, because they have their leaves on them all year round, that they can store carbon more. And then other people would say the older trees, because the younger trees are growing quickly, but then the older trees are more stable. So I would think personally that it's the ecosystem. It's like a stable, once you plant a diversity of trees, they're probably all helping each other in different ways. So I don't think it's just one tree by itself. How many types of trees are there in Ireland? Well, there's loads of trees in Ireland, but in terms of native trees, like they're the ones that were here since the Ice Age, we have around 24 or 25. There's a little book, and we might share the link. I don't know if you can see this here. It's on the Tree Council of Ireland, and it's called Our Trees. And it was from the Millennium Tree Planting Project. And most of you weren't even born then, because that's 21 years ago. But this book is amazing. It's a brilliant source of information. And we can put the link for anyone to get it. This would name all the trees, and not just the trees, but also the other woodland plants like gorse, blackthorn, bramble, honeysuckle. So it kind of gives you an idea of all the different plants that you'll find in the woodland. Now, would non-native trees be as good for biodiversity? That's a really good question. I think what we try and do is, you can't ever have all of one or the other. If you're going to plant trees, we generally say try and plant native trees, especially around your perimeter or in the woodlands, but you can always have non-native trees mixed in as well. So you could have anything, like in my garden, I would have walnut, cherry blossom, magnolia, and lots of different non-native trees. But I usually make sure that my perimeters, my edges, and most of my trees are native. But the non-native trees can be really good for insects as well. Sycamore is really good. Bees love sycamore. Beech trees, people love them as well, and the nuts feed a lot of creatures. So I think it's about diversity, a mixture of everything. And humans, we've always moved plants around as well for different reasons. So so if you've non-native trees in your grounds, that's okay, but try and put in some natives then as well. So what's the most common tree in Ireland? That's a really good question. I don't know if Claire has any ideas here. I'm guessing if you live in really wet places, you're going to have lots of willow and alder and birch. So we get a lot of that here where I'm living. I live on the side of a wet mountain. And then if you live in the drier parts, maybe of Kildare or Wicklow, you might get like more oak woods, but then there's oak woods there in Killarney as well. But that's a tricky question. I think it depends on where you live. What's the smallest tree in Ireland? That's a very good question. I don't know if Claire has any thoughts. I know, so if you think of trees, some trees are like tall canopy trees. So they'd be the oak, the yew, the ash. But then there's the other ones that are called sub-canopy. So they grow maybe 25, 30 feet or 10 meters if you're doing meters. And I'm guessing like the Guelder rose, the spindle, the elder, like they all grow a bit smaller. So that's why in the woodlands you want tall oaks and ashes, and then you want lower plants like elder and hazel. But we don't have any tiny like bonsai trees the way they might have in other countries. The biggest tree in Ireland, that's a good question. I think we'll have to do some research here, because there is an activity, if you go onto the LEAF website, there is an activity of how to tell the age of a tree without cutting it down, and the height of a tree. So you could always do that little activity and see if you can find the tallest tree closer to you. The biggest tree, I mean, I don't know, Claire might mention the tree in Maynooth, but I know the Brian Boru tree that I was at in Clare, you'd have needed maybe 8 or 10 humans to go around, you know, well, maybe, yeah, around 6 or 8 humans to hold hands around the tree. So that would be, I don't know how many you think the one that you were looking at?
Yeah, I think that the tallest tree in Ireland, I think, is in Powerscourt. I think it's a Douglas fir, and it's over 60 meters. Yeah, Ruth just put it in the chat there.
Wow.
Yeah, just over 60 meters, which is extremely tall. Bit taller than Croke Park if anyone's ever done the walk around the top of it.
Wow, that's amazing, isn't it? Now, someone asked another trick question. What is my favorite tree? It's funny because, you know, every month the trees do something different. So at the moment, if I looked around the hedges, like the hawthorn is in full bloom and it looks incredible. But then when the elder comes, I love the elder. So I kind of think I love all trees. I don't know if I have an actual favorite. So do you have to space trees evenly apart? That's a really good question, because in a woodland, there's no straight lines in nature and there's no exact spaces. But what happens is, if we're planting trees with a school, we would plant them a meter apart, which is 3 feet. And we'd plant, and even if you've only a tiny space in a corner, you could actually put 5 trees in that corner if they're a meter apart, because you could have a taller tree like an oak, or and then you could always have a holly and a spindle and a Guelder rose or a hazel. So you can kind of, and then you can also tip them at the top if you don't want them to get too big. So there are things that you can do, but I would generally put them, but when birds drop the seeds, like if they eat a berry and then they drop the seed in their poop with a bit of compost, they're not planning where to put it. They just put it where it drops where it is. Or if little mouse buries a hazelnut. So often trees will grow close to each other. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, because in a woodland habitat, you actually want the trees to be really close to each other, because that's how the birds and insects can all hide. Are there poisonous trees in Ireland? So the one that comes to mind is the yew tree. And people would say that all parts of the yew tree are poisonous, except for the one bit of it, but generally. And then they used the yew tree to make arrows, the bow and arrow. And some people, they would have used them because they were poisonous as well, but they're also a really good wood to make bows and arrows with. Which trees have the biggest leaves? And what's the most common tree in Ireland? Now, the biggest leaves in Ireland, I don't know, Claire, you might help me here. I'm trying to think now, because if I think of a tree from another country, in the magnolia, there's some tropical trees, like they get massive leaves. But in Ireland, one of the things we get, like the ash leaf, when you look at the ash leaf, it's like all the little leaves together make the big leaf, one leaf together, even though they all look like separate leaves. But I think it'll kind of depend as well where they are in the woodland. Often if they're in the shade, they get bigger because they're trying to get the light from the sun to make their food, which is the photosynthesis. And if they're getting, and I'd often find an oak tree that has really big leaves on it and then small leaves as well, because they're kind of like solar panels in a way. That's what leaves are doing. They're absorbing the sun's energy. Trying to go down here. So yeah, I think yew, is there any other poisonous, Claire or Maeve, that you can think? I think yew is the one. I mean, you don't tend to, if you took a lot of leaves, wood has a thing in it called tannin, which they use to tan leather, you know, and so if you took in a leaf into your stomach, it would have the same effect. So in general, we would say not to eat any leaves. You can use the flowers and the berries of some trees, but you have to be really careful and you have to know what you're picking. That's why you need to learn a bit of plant identification. What's the best tree to plant in your garden? I would say 3 trees together. I would, rather than one. And if I only had a tiny space, I'd put in a hazel and a holly and possibly a Gelder rose, which is a native Irish tree that people haven't heard of. But then I'd love to put elder in as well, and I'd love hawthorn. So I'd like to find room for all of them. But yeah, I would always try and plant 3 trees together if you can. Now, I'm just going to check the old time. Yeah, no, we're okay for... So what trees grow best right beside the Atlantic? So I don't know where you are. I don't know if you're up Donegalway or down Kerry or Mayo, but if you've got the Atlantic gales coming in and salty winds, we would say like willow and alder, they're good ones, but elder is really good as well. But the most important thing is you'd have to plant a few rows together to create a shelter belt. Because if anyone sees trees that are growing with the salt winds, usually one side of the tree is kind of burnt off with the salt and it's growing like this. But so you have to plant a few rows of trees to get some shelter. So that's a bit of a longer question to answer probably. And should I say now, I know it's coming to 20 to 11, so some people you might need to go or you might need to go on your breaks, but we're going to stay on. So if anyone wants to ask more questions, and I can always open up the, you know, if someone needs to say something. So just in case anyone has to go, don't worry, and you can always come back to the recording. What native Irish tree is the rarest? Now, I'm going to guess one, but Claire and Maeve might have another idea. I would think, personally, spindle, in that people don't know anything about spindle, and it's a fabulous tree, but it was grown in the hedges, and the inside wood is so hard that they used it to make the spindle in the loom. So when you're weaving wool and things like that, that's what spindle is used for, but it's a gorgeous tree. So if you ever get a chance to plant one of those in your school grounds, and it doesn't get really tall either, it's a really good one. Have any trees got star-shaped leaves? That's interesting. I don't know. I know some trees have like, you know, what would they call, like hand-shaped leaves, like all the maples and the sycamore. But star-shaped leaves, I would have to look that up myself. I will see if I can find that out, unless anyone else can think of one. What's the weakest tree in Ireland? So in terms of weakness, I'd be thinking of shallow roots, because most of our native Irish trees, their roots go deep down into the soil. But there are some trees, but I would be thinking maybe of the evergreen, like if I think of Sitka or some of the pine trees, they have shallow roots. And you know, the Leylandii, that's another one that people have grown in their gardens. It's the big evergreen one. If there's a big storm, they tend to come over because in the storm, because they've got quite shallow roots. But again, I'm not 100% there. What wood is most used for building? That's a really good question. I think it depends on what you're building. So some wood can handle being outside. Larch is one of the ones that they'd use for the outside of, you know, buildings and offices. And inside, they tend to use oak and walnut and other woods as well. So, but in the past, years ago, before we started using concrete, we would have used hazel and willow and soil to build our houses, you know, so kind of depends on where you live as well and what's around. What trees can survive extreme temperatures? That's a really good question, actually, because we do have a change in climate. So that is going to change how trees grow. I'm going to guess, if I think up near the Arctic, one of the most common trees up at near the Arctic is the birch. And I'm reckoning, but you know, again, there could be some other trees that are, but I reckon birch can grow really well in really cold conditions. What's the most colourful tree in Ireland? That's a lovely question. I think at this time of the year, it'd be hawthorne, because it's like just in full bloom. But then the tree is also called the fire tree or fire bush, because in the autumn, in the summer, it gets red, pink berry, like kind of little pink and orange berries and seeds. But in the autumn, its leaves go all bright red for a few weeks, and before it drops its leaves. So that's called, one of the nickname is the fire bush. So, but then again, oak, when it gets its leaves, like a lot of them, they can change colors during the year. So that's always keeps it interesting. What is the strongest woodland? That's a really good question. I would think the strongest woodland are the oldest woodlands, like the ones that have been there the longest, because they're like a stable ecosystem. So the woods in places like Killarney, or I'm always going to say woods in Kerry, because they're the ones I'm most familiar with. But any of the older woodlands, they're going to be the strongest woodlands. How do you find the age of a tree? So with the age of a tree, one way, but we don't do it, you cut the tree down and you count the rings, because every ring shows a year of growth. And it also tells us whether it was a dry year or lots of water, like a wet year, because the size of the ring. But because we don't want to cut trees down for that purpose, other people, they have a little special drill that they put into the tree, and when they take it out, they take a little sample. But what we do is, there's the resource sheets on the LEAF website, and you actually get a measuring tape and you measure the girth or the circumference, like the width of the tree, the whole way around. You have to hug the tree and put a measuring tape around it, and you measure it. And on average, a tree grows 2.5 centimeters a year. And so you do the maths. So if you get 60 centimeters, I'm gonna be bad with my maths now, and then you have 2.5, your tree could be around 25 years old. But then again, sometimes trees grow tall and skinny if they're in the woods, or if they're out on their own, they get really big because they have more space. So it's a bit of it's not always the right answer, but it's a bit of fun doing it, the activity. What happens if you take a growing tree out and move it? That is a very good question. We would say not to do that, only to do that between October and March, because that's the winter time and it's dormant. But there's a chance that the tree, if you do it when the tree is young, it should be fine. But if the tree is older, it mightn't survive. So it depends on the tree and you need to make sure that it's at the right time of the year, and you'd have to give it a really good watering as well. So but if it's a tall big old tree, I wouldn't be moving it, but if it's a young tree, you could. What tree is of the most benefit to birds and animals? So that's a really good question. So again, I don't think it's any one tree. I think it's groups of trees together, because if you remember the slide about how trees like to grow in communities, the more diverse, the more different trees you have together, they will all feed different insects and different birds at different times. So if you had like an oak and a holly and a hazel, but you also had some ivy and brambles, and then you had moss on the ground and a few like wild garlic or bluebells, it's kind of the ecosystem feeds everything. Like I do know in this book, it will give you little facts, and you might do a bit of that with Claire tomorrow, like that. Like an oak tree can support something like 250 insects. A hawthorne, I think, is even more. But at the same time, we can't know all this. That's just kind of what we know from observing. So there's lots of things going on that maybe we can't see. And another really important part of the woodlands is the mushrooms. So if anyone sees fungi popping up, that's actually a really good sign, because underneath the ground, there's like an invisible worldwide web, wood wide web, they call it, instead of, it's not the internet, it's like the web of there's kind of like the fungal network, and that's how trees pass water and nutrients and how they kind of communicate with each other. So that's where fungi are actually really important in the woodland system as well. That's right. If a bit of blackthorn gets in under your skin, it can cause, particularly at one time of the year, you can get an infection from it. So yeah, so often we don't plant blackthorn in the school grounds because of that, but you can always plant it out at home. So in Lusk, they're going to go out to the yard now, and they've planted loads of trees in Lusk. I know they've got a fabulous woodland there. So that's it.